Calleguas Municipal Water District, for those of you not familiar, is the wholesale water agency for most of southern Ventura County. We provide water service to about 630,000 folks within the service area, which I'll show you here in just a minute. A little flyover of Ventura County, zooming into the Calleguas territory. We're going to talk a little bit about our area and the reason we were formed. This is a map showing the groundwater basins within the Ventura County area, the Thousand Oaks area shown here. There is some groundwater available, and the city is looking at that currently to see what can be done to recover some of that groundwater going forward. But nonetheless, the workhorse groundwater basins are shown here. And what we had 50, 60 plus years ago is a situation where you had declining groundwater levels or deteriorating water quality, or a combination of both. And that led to the formation of Calleguas to go out and find a reliable supply of supplemental water. We looked at the Sespe Creek to the north of us on the Santa Clara River. We looked at the Kern River as well, ultimately opting to join Metropolitan Water District in 1960. So these are some headlines from the day, actually, going back to the early 50s and to 1960, from headlines from different newspapers, local newspapers that were in existence at the time, just kind of giving you a flavor of the concerns that we had with respect to our local water resources, and the bottom line being that we had to go out and find an imported water supply to reliably meet demands to provide for population growth and economic growth as well. Here's Calleguas' service area shown in yellow, essentially south of the Santa Clara River. You can see just to the north of the yellow region. As I mentioned, we deliver water to about 630,000 folks, roughly 75% of the county's population. Within that yellow region, we meet 75% of the demand. So there is some groundwater use, particularly in the Moore Park, Camarillo, and larger degree on the Oxnard Plain as well. Our annual demands are roughly 100 to 110,000 acre feet of water a year. We don't talk in terms of gallons or units that you're used to seeing on your water bills. We talk in terms of acre feet, so enough water to cover a football field or a soccer field with a foot of water. That's how much water we import into the service area each and every year. We're a wholesale water agency, so we have 19 retail purveyors. We're the primary water supplier for the region. Then you have the retail purveyors, the City of Thousand Oaks, Cal Water to the east portion of the county, Cal American to the west, and a number of other small city districts and private water companies, mutual water companies that cover the remaining part of our service area. So as far as Calleguas' territory is concerned, I've mentioned reliance on Calleguas earlier this morning and how reliant Conejo and the Simi Valleys are. We essentially can divide up our service area into three puzzle pieces, and you can see the level of reliance on the imported water system shown here. The Oxnard Plain area, which would be the city of Oxnard, Port Hueneme, the Navy base, Ventura County, roughly 50-50 in terms of reliance on imported water. The Camarillo, Santa Rosa Valley, anywhere from 40 to 60%, depending on the year. As you head up into the Moore Park area, that triangular area, about 75% reliant on Calleguas water, and the Conejo and Simi, roughly 100%. A little bit of groundwater use currently in the Simi Valley area by the Golden State Water Company, and to some degree a smaller percentage by the city of Simi Valley, but nonetheless, virtually 100%. So as I mentioned, in 1960, we joined the Metropolitan Water District, family of agencies, metropolitan service area shown here, extending from our service area to the north to the U.S.-Mexico border and all urbanized areas in between. Metropolitan is comprised of 26 member agencies, covers, I believe, over 50% of California's total population at this point, over 19 million folks, 5,200 square miles, annual deliveries of on the order of 2 million acre feet of water each year. Back in the 1930s, Metropolitan focused its efforts on bringing water in, importing water in from the Colorado River system, Lake Havasu, essentially, and it constructed its Colorado River Aqueduct, completed just before the start of World War II, and a length of almost 250 miles and a capacity to bring in a little over 1 million acre feet of water per year there at Parker Dam, just for orientation. So it wasn't long after that it was assumed by the state leaders at the time, Governor Edmund Brown Sr., primarily was chief architect of the state water project, realizing that the Colorado River essentially wouldn't provide enough supply for the region. We began to look at the Sierra Nevadas, and particularly the Feather River Basin, the Sierra Nevada mountain range, the northern portion of that range divided into three. The northern Sierra, the central Sierra around the Tahoe, and as you head down to Mono Basin, and then the southern Sierra broken up, as you see here. The system is divided or receives water from the Sacramento River to the north, the San Joaquin to the south. The headworks of the State Water Project system, again, which we are virtually 100% reliant on here in our region, is Lake Oroville. And Lake Oroville receives the runoff from the Feather River watershed, bounded by Mount Lassen to the north, and essentially the California border to the east. So from that point, water is released from Lake Oroville down the Feather River, and finally commingled with Sacramento River from water released from Lake Shasta to the north, ultimately finding its way in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, which many of you know is truly a quagmire in many respects, from environmental issues, water resource issues. Nonetheless, it is our primary supply within this area. It is the largest estuary on the West Coast, 57 man-made islands over the last century and a half that have been reclaimed essentially primarily for agricultural irrigation, but to some degree urban uses as well. Over 1,100 miles actually of levees and dredged waterways that comprise the system. Supports 55 fish species, 750 animal and plant species, a number of species which are endangered, sensitive, or threatened in some way. And the competing interest here is it provides water for 25 million residents in the state. So 2/3 of the state, again, 100% of you virtually, are relying on this system. Also provides irrigation water for 3 million acres of farmland. Where the rub is with the State Water Project is it was widely acknowledged even back in the 40s and 50s that the facilities to move water through this system should have been located at the north end of the delta, the pumps essentially, to move water from the higher flows and the higher quality flows in the Sacramento River to the north, which brings in about 80% of the total annual input into the delta or flow into the delta, roughly 15% from the south, San Joaquin, and a smaller percentage from some of the eastern tributaries not shown on the map. So the idea was to provide water from that higher flow, higher quality water in the Sacramento. The political will, the political winds at the time just couldn't get that done. Delta interests have always opposed infrastructure that would ultimately move or export water outside of their area. You have 6 counties that extend into the Delta, all very vocal, very active politically, and very concerned about water issues in that region. So nonetheless, the pumps were not located in the north. They were located at the south of the Delta, near the town of Tracy, and we've been paying for that issue for the last half century. Essentially, the Delta is the broken link in the chain of the State Water Project, again, beginning at Lake Oroville all the way down to the California Aqueduct, ultimately ending up for us in Lake Castaic. Here's the reality and what we've seen in terms of reliability on the State Water Project going back in time when deliveries first began in 1968. And you can see we're receiving 100% of allocations early on. That red line is the 10-year running average. And you can see the last few years how that's really tailed off. What's changed? Well, what's changed is regulation, primarily. To some degree, Mother Nature hasn't cooperated over certain years, but nonetheless, a lot of that is triggered by Endangered Species Act requirements that has throttled back pumping on both the state and federal systems. Moving on from the Delta, what's next? Well, you've probably heard a lot about the Bay Delta Conservation Plan over the last 18 months. It's somewhat morphed over the last couple of months into California Water Fix, plus the California Eco Restore, which 2 separate elements, one for water supply reliability, one for restoring habitat. So from the Delta, our water is then transported down the California Aqueduct. And I turn the state on its side here. This is showing a profile of the aqueduct system, which is just shown off to the left here, heading down the state. And this shows the elevation changes, the pumping, essentially the energy that's needed to move water through these various pumping stations to get into central and southern California is enormous. We have the big lift here, which is getting water over 2,000 feet over the Tehachapi's to get it ultimately into Lake Pyramid and Lake Castaic for use by San Fernando Valley, Ventura County, and other areas within the Metropolitan territory. So from here, we end up at Lake Castaic. We're going to zoom in a little bit. Lake Castaic shown here, Lake Pyramid just to the north up I-5. I'm sure all of you are familiar with those locations. You may drive by Lake Pyramid and ask yourself, it's full. How can we possibly be in a drought? Well, the truth is Lake Pyramid water is there for emergencies only. And when I say emergencies, it's there dedicated in the event we lose the Delta, we lose the California aqueduct, we can rely on that water. It's part of a 6-month supply for us in the event of, again, a catastrophe. So it stays fairly full year in and year out. Lake Castaic, however, is down about 30% of capacity at this time due to demands. So from Lake Castaic, water is transported by Metropolitan. This is where Metropolitan systems begin with the 20-foot diameter, I'll say it again, 20-foot diameter foothill feeder, massive pipe to bring water into the San Fernando Valley, providing for delivery to residents within the western portion of the Department of Water and Power service area, and also tapping into Calleguas' service area. As you can see here, those aren't freeways. That's Metropolitan's Calleguas' distribution system within the heart of Calleguas' service area, distributing water to, again, the 6 cities and 13 other retail water providers. So from here, we'll get into the drought. There's the Great Seal of the state of California. Some are proposing that we change that seal. Great Seal of the Drought of California, given conditions. Perhaps even changing the state flag. None of these have gained much momentum, but nonetheless, they're out there. Talking about the Northern Sierra precipitation, the Feather River watershed, which is so key to us. From a water planning perspective, look at water issues in a water year, beginning October 1st through September 30th of the following year. And that green region you see at the top of the state is the Northern Sierra zone. And in an average year, we'll receive upwards of 50 inches of total precipitation, rainfall, snowpack water content combined. The last 3 winters, well, I should say winters of 2012, 13, and 14, you can see them here, below average conditions. The last winter, this kind of brings us up to current, at least the first part of June anyway. So when we talk about 4 below average years in terms of total precip, this is what we're referring to. It even gets more dramatic when we look at snowpack. Again, looking at that same essentially water year, but from a snowpack perspective, we essentially begin in December and start to ramp down around April and May. April 1st is typically where you see, it's essentially all you're going to see in terms of snowpack. So that's why that chart is shown, this average trend here of snowpack water content as of April 1st. Where we were in 1977, which prior to this year was the historic low, at April 1st, we had a 25% snowpack. And many of us who've been around long enough thought, boy, that's just a bar we don't want to hit again. Well, unfortunately, we did hit it again last year, winter of 2014, and thought, boy, it can't get much worse, can it? Well, it did. This past year, we're at 5% snowpack in the Northern Sierra. So miserable, miserable conditions. A couple other charts just to kind of provide a little more drama on what we've seen, particularly the last 4 years, this drop. Last 10 years shown there off to the left. The last year, the lowest years on record, the last 2 are in that grouping. Looking back to 1950, when reliable records were first were maintained, you can see that red line is essentially 100% of average, and you can see the variability. And this is what drives water planners nuts, trying to meet demand throughout the service area. This is the nightmare we have to deal with. But this little red blip there, that's this year, 5%. So all of this led David Rizzardo, Chief of Snow Surveys with the Department of Water Resources, to state a few weeks ago, we're not only setting a new low, we're completely obliterating the old record, and that couldn't be a more true statement. This is looking at over Half Dome, and this is the Southern Sierra. Again, not part of the Feather River watershed, but still an indication of the health of snowpack conditions within the entire Sierra region. All of these photos you're going to see are from March of the particular year. This was March of 2011 when Mammoth had its all-time record, 55 feet of snow that year. That's March of 2012, March of 13, March of 14. This was last March. No snow, essentially no snow, right? So what does this mean? We've talked about precip, rainfall, snowpack conditions. We also got to talk about runoff. What does this mean in terms of those conditions and refilling our reservoirs? Well, if we look at the Sacramento River, Basin area, essentially. Long-term average, you have about 18 million acre feet of water that runs off. Well, you can see what we've seen in the last 4 years, what the expectation is for 2015. We haven't talked a lot about the Colorado River yet, but you can see there, we're also below average conditions, 15-year drought on the Colorado River. A lot of folks just like to focus on the last 4 here in the state system, but when you look at the chart doesn't lie. That's the data. You only see 3 years in the last 15 that we've been above average in the Sacramento River system as well. So, precipitation, runoff, the impact on reservoirs. As of December 7th last year, I mentioned Lake Oroville, the headworks of the system, San Luis Reservoir, the reservoirs that are circled in red here, San Luis Reservoir, key reservoir south of the Delta. It's imperative that we move as much water as we can through the Delta and park it in storage, surplus water when it's available, to then provide deliveries into the central and southern California areas. Then you have Lake Castaic shown in the lower red box. So that's as of December 7th, before we had a couple of those storms roll through that month. And I'm going to fast forward to March of this current year. You can see some improvement. The blue bar there is it was the storage level at that point in time. The red line is the average condition for that time of year. And you see a lot of yellow. That's bad. That's the excess capacity that's available for storage. So we see some improvement. Lake Oroville essentially capped out this year at about 50%. And normally you would assume with a snowpack that you would see runoff occur through at least June, and you would see reservoirs rise as you head into the early part of the summer. Some improvement in San Luis Reservoir as well, to go back at 27% of capacity back in December, rose to 2/3 full at that point. But let's bring it up to current. You can see Lake Oroville at 50 a couple months ago is now down to 40. San Luis Reservoirs dropped to 42. Castaic, some of that water has been moved south, a little bit stored in Lake Castaic, so you have a little bit of a bump in Lake Castaic up to 35%, but still nothing to hang your hat on or write home about. Nonetheless, pretty grim, as you can see on the San Joaquin side. Some of these reservoirs, a lot of yellow is showing. That's why you hear more and more about concerns up in the lower San Joaquin counties, areas of Tulare County, et cetera, and the irrigators that are shut off from some of their surface water supplies. Well, that's why, to some degree. So looking a little closer at Lake Oroville, again, water year, October 1st through September 30th, the typical trend that we see, or filling of the reservoir over the year. And where we were as of December of last year, we were approaching a historic low. November of last year, we were 3 feet from an historic low, which was from the winter of 1977. So grim that you had folks that hard to see, but zoomed in on them, and you can see there's a line here. They had to rappel down from the parking lot just to get to the boathouses, get access to their boats. So this brings us to current as of today compared to the last 3 years. So as I mentioned, we typically are filling Lake Oroville and all the other lakes in the system for that matter over the spring and summer months. Well, you can see essentially what we've done. Not much of anything, and we're in a decline mode, and we have been for the last few weeks. The reservoirs last full in May 2012, and each and every year since, we've had this ratcheting down of storage in the system, and now we have it unknown, uncertain where we're going to end this current fiscal year. The expectation, again, is that we're going to be very close to where we were last year, if not below it. The most recent report I saw was that we may be down around 900,000 acre feet of storage in Lake Oroville, which would be a historic low. Looking at what we've seen the last 25 years, spaghetti chart, just give you some perspective. Below each and every year shown on this chart, June 1st level, second lowest, historic low was 1977. So again, if we're going to feel good about anything, maybe feel good about that, but don't get carried away. What's being done by the state to deal with the drought conditions and limited runoff? Well, in 1977, this is an aerial map of the Delta region. Back in 1977, Department of Water Resources constructed 6 or 7 structures, rock structures, dams essentially, or barriers, to prevent seawater intrusion from the San Francisco Bay. Much of the Delta islands, these reclaimed islands, are below sea level, upwards of 30 feet below sea level. So you have a natural tendency, particularly during high tide, for saline water to enter in from the bay and foul some of our fresh water sources here in the Delta. So given the limited flows that year from Shasta and Oroville and some of the other reservoirs, They placed these barriers to kind of inhibit that flow and reduce the need to bring more water, release more water, limited water that was available in those reservoirs. So that's what was done in '77. Here's the one we're doing this year. Here at the False River, they call it the False River location. One barrier. There were 3 that were ultimately proposed earlier in the year, a couple up in the north that were ultimately denied, primarily due to the Fish and Wildlife objections. So we went from 3 to 1, and we're keeping our fingers crossed that that's going to help. It not only provides some security at our pumping plants here shown, Banks, the state project pumping facility in the Central Valley, federal facility located here. It'll prevent fouling of water sources for some of the internal users within the Delta, again, primarily agricultural folks. But a lot of concerns with the Delta region. We're hopeful that the barrier will prevent some of the salinity intrusion. Again, keeping our fingers crossed that that'll help diminish the amount of water that we have to release from upstream to push back that salt. Colorado River, just the last couple of slides. We do receive a little bit of water from the Colorado River. Since the partial completion of the state water project in the early 70s, for the last 40 years, we've been essentially 100% reliant on the state. However, given the dire conditions on the state system, Metropolitan has had to make some changes in their operations and their facilities to move Colorado River water up to the northern part of their service area, Calleguas, Las Virgenes service area, and also the San Fernando Valley. So we're currently receiving roughly 25% of our demands are met with Colorado River water. The Colorado River is in no better shape in terms of drought conditions, of course. Over the last 15 years, it's been 15 years since the reservoirs, Lake Mead and Lake Powell, have been full. Some of you have seen these photos probably of the bathtub ring, roughly 130, 135 feet below or low in capacity. This is a chart looking back when the beginning of time for Lake Mead, when it was finished construction in the late 30s and began filling in the late 1930s, and where we are currently. The last 15 years, you see this tailing off of storage in Lake Mead. And if you're to draw a line back from where we are currently to where we were at last point when we saw this level was, again, during the initial fill back in 1938. Approaching shortage conditions, some fairly decent news given some rain precipitation events in the Colorado River Basin over the last few weeks. We're not likely to enter a shortage condition for the next year or two, which is good news, particularly for folks in Arizona and Nevada, who would take the first hit on terms of allocations from the Colorado River system. Metropolitan has a higher priority, so have a little bit of a buffer there. But nonetheless, you see the trend. The trend is not our friend in this case. The one upside with the Colorado River system is the sheer volume of water storage that's available in Lake Mead and Lake Powell. Both Shasta and Oroville pale in comparison. Lake Shasta, 5 million acre feet. Lake Oroville, 3.5 million acre feet. Lake Mead and Lake Powell, both when full, are 25 million acre feet. It's all about storage, whether you want to believe it or not. It really is. Metropolitan. Last couple of slides, this shows the last 100 years, and you see in the 1960s and 70s all the storage capacity that was constructed. I want to focus on this little blip here around 2000. That is Metropolitan's Diamond Valley Reservoir. That was a $2 billion reservoir, and they got a lot of heat for constructing this and spending the money. But I'll tell you what, we're all glad we have it because we've been living off of this facility for the last 18 to 24 months. Located out in the Hemet area, essentially doubled their surface water reservoir storage within Southern California. And why did they do it? Well, as I showed you, a lot of activity in the state back in the mid part of the 20th century, and then it stopped, flatlined. Metropolitan realized that we needed to take care of our own needs to some degree, to the degree we could, and that's why we have the Diamond Valley Reservoir, among other storage in the Central Valley region, where we stored 500,000 acre feet of water under the Kern County area and draw that water out to meet drought demands. Metropolitan water storage, again, I mentioned Lake Pyramid, that emergency storage. That's this increment here, part of it, 600,000 acre feet. These blue bars are the drought storage, the seasonal storage, and you can see going back the last few years how that's fluctuated. We were at an all-time high in 2012, and what's happened from the end of 2013 to 2014, we had to tap almost half of that regional storage to meet demands. Now going forward, what's the plan? Well, we get concerned when we start to hit this magic mark of about 1 million acre feet in storage and Metropolitan and its member agencies, including Calleguas, began to talk about water supply allocations, mandatory cutbacks. That's why, beginning July 1, we will be in a mandatory cutback, because we're beginning to approach this at the end of the current calendar year. The plan is, over the next year, we'll tap and draw another 300 to 350,000 acre feet from regional storage, state project storage, and in turn, we're going to have a cutback at a retail level of 15% impact, maximum impact. So for Thousand Oaks, it's 15%. The truth is, the state has come down even harder, as you're probably all aware, and everybody has been talking about the conditions here, particularly in Thousand Oaks, looking at a 28% cutback. If you're in the east end of the city, 36% or 32%. Oak Park is 32%. Some major hurdles that are going to have to be overcome over the next few months in order to avoid any penalties from the state. The state has indicated they don't intend to come down heavy-handed, but we all know how that could play out. The reality is they've told the agencies that are affected by their regulation that their intent is to focus on those agencies that aren't meeting their targets and see what they can do to help before they potentially levy penalties. So we'll see how that all shakes out. Look me up if you have questions related to the imported water supplies. Thank you.